including not applicable. My name is Dennis Palmer, and I will be your host and your moderator. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to enter your questions and comments in chat directed toward the panelists. The presentation and recording will be made available to participants a short time after completion of the webinar. In addition, we'll follow up any questions that we are not able to be addressed during the webinar. I'm going to go through the agenda topics real quick, and then we'll introduce our presenters. So we'll start out with an overview, then we'll go through testing approach and requirements. We'll look at working papers and evidence, population and sampling, handling and documenting exceptions, and not applicable requirement statements, and then we will follow up the session with Q&A. I'd like to introduce our presenters: Bob Musselman, Director of Quality; Ida Monique, Director of IT Audit and Assurance Services; and Samantha Lalama, Manager of Assurance Operational Initiatives. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to our presenters. Ida?
Thank you, Dennis. Welcome, everyone. And this is a session that will cover our enforcement process. As Dennis has mentioned, we'll have a couple of topics. And as you notice, the presenters today, it's the teams that you deal with mainly once you submit your HITRUST assessment. So just to start us off, a quick overview of this session objectives. With every HITRUST assessment, we expect that the external assessor has performed a sufficient level of testing to support the scores. And to ensure we maintain the integrity of the certification process, we've also worked to ensure that our process is consistent and that the testing is also consistent as well by providing various guidance. And now we do have the assessment handbook, which is a common guidance reference for all parties involved. That's the assessed entity, the assessors, and also the HITRUST QA team. In addition to that, we want to ensure that our review process is reliable and the feedback we are providing you is consistent. So the main objectives for this session is to mainly cover the topics around testing and documentation expectation for the external assessor. So we'll cover several topics: testing requirement and approach, the work paper and evidence, and then population and sampling requirements. And in case you identify exceptions, how do you manage those? So how you handle exceptions. And we also included the topic around not applicable requirement statements. So to start us off today, I'll turn it to Samantha, and Samantha will take us through the first topic.
Thank you, Ida. Our first topic will be the testing approach and requirements. This is mainly found in chapter 11.2 of the assessment handbook, with some references to 11.1 that I'll point out as we go through. These testing approach and requirements are kind of the baseline general requirements for testing of validated assessments. So we'll get right in. Starting off, we'll have 5 points that we'll go through here at the top, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail on some specific topics. So right off the bat, all requirement statements within a validated assessment must be validated by an external assessor. When the external assessor is performing that validation, we expect them to perform a sufficient level of testing, which could include walkthroughs and other testing and audit procedures that will allow them to validate the assessed entity's scoring within the assessment and also ensure that any gaps have been identified. In the handbook, section 11.1 includes some examples of audit techniques that are acceptable to be used throughout your HITRUST assessment. So you can use combinations of those techniques that includes walkthroughs, interviews, observations, inspection of documents like policies and procedures, sample-based testing, reliance, inheritance, and there's more listed in that section as well. Next, you'll hear this a few times throughout today's webinar, specific to inquiry. So when inquiry is used during either walkthroughs or interviews, there is a requirement for the assessors to review additional supporting documentation that would corroborate that interview or inquiry. So any scores need to be supported by more than just inquiry. There has to be supporting evidence included as well. Then our last 2 points here are related to on-site testing or lack thereof. So HITRUST external assessors are not actually required to be physically on-site to perform any of their audit procedures. There are other options for using evidence to demonstrate that the assessed entity has met requirements that would, typically be looked at during an on-site walkthrough. And we actually have an appendix A9 that includes some of the requirement statements that you would typically think of as being, requiring an on-site walkthrough, and it lists some examples of documentation and other procedures that you could perform as an alternative to that on-site testing. So go look at Appendix A9 for some examples of that. Moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about some criteria in the handbook specific to the test plan. So the test plan is a document that the external assessor must prepare for all validated assessments and upload into MyCSF. And the intention of the test plan is to outline the anticipated testing approach that the assessor will take for all of the in-scope requirement statements within the assessment. We expect the test plan to include the nature, timing, and extent of testing for all evaluative elements within all requirement statements. If your assessment includes within its scope any third parties that manage or perform certain controls within the scope, we do want to see within the test plan the approach that the assessed entity and the external assessor have agreed on for ensuring there is coverage over those third parties, whether it be direct testing, reliance, or inheritance. We want to see that documented in the test plan to know that you thought through that approach as you were planning for the assessment. And finally, for any population and sample-based tests that are performed, we do want to see the populations documented within the test plan and some details around where that population comes from and how you plan to pull that population for your testing. Next, we will move on to the next slide. This one is about the management rep letter. So here we'll talk about just mainly some timing requirements related to the rep letter. So the intention of the management rep letter is to be signed at the conclusion of the external assessor's fieldwork period. So once they've completed all of their testing and validation, management of the assessed entity would sign the representation letter. This must be done after the external assessor has agreed to all requirement statement scoring within the assessment. Again, at the completion of that 90-day fieldwork period. And our last point here is just a little bit more about timing and fieldwork period, not necessarily directly related to the rep letter, but do want to also point out that the external assessors can begin some of their planning activities prior to the start of that 90-day fieldwork period. So things like determining assessment scope, creating that test plan that we just talked about, and then preparing and sending documentation request lists to the customer are activities that we would consider planning that could happen prior to the start of that 90-day fieldwork period. So you'll start off with your planning, you'll have the 90-day fieldwork period to do the actual validation and testing, and then conclude with signing the management rep letter. Go to the next slide, please. And we'll wrap up this section talking about what we call the incubation period. So this is I think a very important topic within the assessment handbook. We'll talk about some dates here and some examples. We have this timeline. It may be something that you want to come back and look at in the assessment handbook after we talk through it, just to make sure you've wrapped your head around these dates, but try to go through it slowly so that it's clear to everyone. Starting off with implementation testing, a requirement is that all controls established by the assessed entity must be implemented for at least 90 days before the external assessor performs testing of that control. Then for policy and procedure, we have a little bit of a shorter incubation period. On those maturity levels, it is a minimum of 60 days from the time the policy or procedure is implemented to the time that it can be tested by the external assessor during the fieldwork period. So we'll look at an example here that we have on the timeline. In this example, on January 15th, the assessed entity implements a new control and also implements their policies and procedures for that control, all on January 15th. Then the external assessor begins their fieldwork period on March 1st. At that point, it hasn't been 60 or 90 days yet. So on that March 1st date, the assessor cannot start off their validation procedures by testing the policy, procedure, or implementation of this control because we haven't hit the incubation period for those maturity levels yet. But come March 15th, the 60-day incubation period for policies and procedures will have lapsed, and the external assessor may, at that point, test the policies and procedures for that new control. Then we get 1 month further, get to April 15th. Now the 90 days has passed since January 15th, and the external assessor may begin testing the implementation of that new control. That falls right in the middle of their fieldwork period that wraps up on June 1st. So all of that to say, kind of main ideas here that one, just because you need to wait to test these things doesn't mean that you can't start your fieldwork period and start testing other controls and other policies and procedures first, and then go pick up those controls and those policies and procedures to test once the incubation period has lapsed. Now, also want to point out here that the 60-day incubation period for policy and procedure does in fact mean that the assessed entity can remediate policies and procedures during the 90-day fieldwork period. So give an example of that. On day 1 of the fieldwork period, if the external assessor reviews certain policies and procedures and identifies deficiencies, the assessed entity can then update their policies and procedures based on that finding. Maybe they finish their update by day 10. We now have to wait the 60 days. So that brings us from day 10 to day 70 of fieldwork. And the assessor at that point still has 20 days left in their 90-day fieldwork period where they can test those policies and procedures and get potentially fully compliant scores based on the remediation. So for policies and procedures, remediations can be made during the fieldwork period as long as you still have at least 60 days to pass before you test those policies and procedures. A final note on the incubation period: if remediation is made with not enough time, either the 60 days or 90 days to pass during the fieldwork period before the new or remediated controls can be tested, the external assessor must score the requirement statement based on the state of the control prior to remediation. So in this example, with the timeline that we have here, if a control is remediated during the month of May, there is not enough time for the assessor to wait the 90 days and then test it, and therefore the scoring must be based on the state of the control before remediation.
Hey, Sam, if I can interrupt you for just a second. We're getting some really good questions in chat. Please make sure you're addressing the questions to the panelists, and we will try to address those at the end. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks, Dennis. And that wraps up this first section. I'll turn it over to Bob to cover our next topic.
Thank you, Samantha. Let's talk a little bit about working papers and supporting evidence. And as we work through these slides, keep in mind that aligning to our guidance and requirements greatly aids in a smooth QA process for you, both in timing and number of questions that the QA analysts may have or not have. So let's look at starting off with chapter 11.3 in the next slide. Talk a little bit about the actual working papers. These are based on the documents and other artifacts collected during the fieldwork period, collectively known as working papers. As they relate to policy and procedure, you want to make sure that you have clear references back from the requirement and its associated evaluative elements and back to where those are specifically covered in policy and procedure. So we often talk a lot about mapping. And so the better the mapping to the working papers, it really helps the QA analyst look at exactly what the assessor saw and reperform that work. And it takes some of the guesswork out of it. There are occasions where certain documents, policy or procedure or both, will have coverage for evaluative elements, but they'll be throughout the document. So again, mapping those specifically back helps greatly. For measured and managed, you'll want to refer to page 2 of the rubric. We have criteria that we go into in great detail, the criteria for metric and what is a measure, operational independent, for instance, and risk treatment. So the same concept here, you're going to want to map how the evidence that you're presenting supports the criteria. And again, you can look at the rubric, page 2, and get a very detailed understanding of that. Why don't we move to the next slide? What the last PRISMA level that I want to talk about is the implemented. And so this is where the sampling comes in for the testing for the implemented PRISMA level. So let's talk a little bit about when you're doing a sample-based testing. So you've got to have a lead sheet. And that lead sheet has to contain certain things. Number one, again, covering the criteria. What's the population? What's the creation date and where did it come from? What's the size? What's the date range? And you're going to pick, a corresponding sample size with that. Also look at the rubric for guidance on those sample sizes. You're also going to want to document the sampling approach. Samantha had touched upon that a little earlier. You want to list the attributes of testing. What we're talking about is the evaluative elements that are enumerated. You're going to want to see where those are covered or not. And again, if you have exceptions, we'll talk about it a little later, how that would impact implemented strength. But you also, again, the overriding is you want to have identifiers back to all the population and reference of the evidence in each sampled artifact. And a well-organized testing lead sheet, again, can't stress it enough, really helps the QA process proceed smoothly. Why don't we move to the next slide? And I'll talk about some more of the requirements. So all of the evidence must be collected during the field work period. The assessor must document the date when each evidence artifact was generated. So let's take a look at some of the different types of evidence. So you could have some verbal information. So you need to document when the date of the inquiry or the response to that inquiry happened. For observational information, what was the date of the observation? Paper documents, when was the document provided by the assessed entity? And then electronic information, we call this systems of record, you might think of it as. When was that generated and what system it came from? And all of these will go to reinforcing all of our timing expectations. Yeah, when they were met, is the evidence current, so on and so forth. So proceeding to the next slide, want to talk a little bit more about the actual evidence that's collected. Some of the requirements are very straightforward. You might look at change tickets, for instance. Well, you would go to the change record system and you might pull your population, of course, based on the date. Some requirements also lend themselves to inspecting multiple areas where that evidence can be found. And when you can do that, the evidence becomes more reliable, more persuasive, we say. And example of that is we have requirements if you're procuring commercial products. So you may want to look at the procurement process. You might want to check vendor contracts, check with legal, provide that for your population, and then go check change records to see if that particular product was implemented in the environment. So you're covering multiple systems of record to address and support the requirement statement. So that's what we mean in that first point. So again, all the evidence collected that supports the requirement scores within the validate must be uploaded to MyCSF and referenced within the test plan. Now, the exception to uploading into MyCSF would come into play during a live QA. And you'd want to review chapter 14.3, goes into more detail about the live QA and its process and what the expectations are. So for those assessed entities that may not want to upload documents, we do provide this additional pathway to look at the supporting documentation. So observations and inspection to support scoring must be performed within the fieldwork period. Observations of configuration screenshots, system parameters, audit logs, etc. Evidence provided by the assessed entity to the external assessor. Supporting those observations, inspections must include a corresponding date within the fieldwork period, and we covered that in a previous slide. And this is very, very important. We do talk about this on occasion, that inquiry alone is not sufficient supporting evidence. And so what I mean by that is if you're asking for an occurrence of a requirement operating and management says, if the assessed entity says, oh, we've not had any of that. Well, that's great for the walkthrough, but the assessor needs to look at systems of record where that might be supported. And of course, that varies from requirement to requirement. We don't take attestations that nothing has occurred or, whatever the supporting evidence might be, that if it did, we do have to back it up with the evidence to corroborate that inquiry. Let's move to the next slide. And well, let's talk really quickly about the assessors must link the supporting evidence individually to each requirement statement, not just a bulk upload. We talk about zip files. We don't allow, again, large zip files with hundreds of documents covering a domain or even the entire assessment. Now that doesn't mean to say if you say pull change tickets and you might have 25 individual screenshots, those can be bundled in one zip file and uploaded to MyCSF for a particular requirement statement. But we really do want to stay away from huge zip files containing everything. It doesn't help with mapping and it takes up a lot of disk space and it generally slows and creates a lot of questions. Also, we wouldn't accept evidence that's embedded in a spreadsheet. So we want what we call discrete documents, right? And not just bundled in a spreadsheet. And I would say also Word documents as well. Let's move to the next slide, where we're going to talk about population and sampling. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ida Monique.
Thank you, Bob. For this topic, population and sampling, I want to start by saying it's quite an intensive topic. During this session, we will only cover some key subtopics around it. I would encourage everybody to make time and review this chapter section. That's chapter 11.4, just because there is a couple of things we've discussed. For those that have gone through the HITRUST assessment process, we've discussed a couple of things, and now they are all documented within the assessment handbook. So I want to begin by mentioning that it's often that the assessor will be required to perform some sample-based testing in order to validate the scores provided by management, and it starts with them identifying the population. So the next slide, I'll be highlighting some key points but not really, not all specific to the population, but once the external assessor has identified the population, some key points to note is one, usually the sample-based testing is expected within the implemented maturity level for each requirement statement. And the indicators now are 2 within my CSF. That requirement statement may have a badge, like the graphic we have on this slide, or within the IP procedures, that the illustrative procedures, we indicate select a sample. So watch for that. And so this applies to all validated types of validated assessments, the I1s, the E1s, and also the R2s. There are situations or events where the external assessor may not deem it not necessary to perform any sample-based testing. What we ask is that they document the rationale of their conclusion to not perform the sample-based testing, so that during our QA review, we may also get to the same conclusion. And this usually makes the QA review go quicker because we are not following up with questions, because if my CSF is indicating we expect a sample-based test, when our reviewers are reviewing that, they are reviewing against the expectations in my CSF. So we would expect the external assessor to document their rationale clearly. The last key point I wanted to point out, in addition to where it's expected within the implemented maturity level, and then in case the assessor deems it not necessary to perform a sample-based test, we would expect them to document it. And then lastly, if an assessment, and this is specific to R2 validated assessments that have scored, measured, and managed, in case there are any requirement statements that will require sample-based testing, please remember, even for measured and managed, you need to follow the HITRUST population and sampling guidance. So the next slide, I just want to highlight some not very new terms to anybody who's been in the audit field for a while, but this is the first time we are outlining it in any reference document for HITRUST. So we've added some documentation around time-based population and item-based population, and I'll cover each one of them individually. So I'll start with time-based populations. These are populations that are pooled over for a period of time, and a good example for this is like population of change tickets, or the population of new hires in an organization, or terminated employees for a period of time within an organization. And the common one is also daily backups. So just keep in mind the total population for time-based, the total population period for time-based population may not be greater than 1 year. What does that mean? And many times the question has been, when do those periods start? Just keep in mind the sampling must be at least 90 days and may not begin more than 1 year from the start of fieldwork period. So the key date that I believe now we've clarified is the start of the fieldwork period. And then always make sure you include in your sample, if you are taking a sample from a time-based population, ensure you include a sample that has the fieldwork period, testing period as well. And always remember, if the population you're using does not include a date within the fieldwork period, select an additional sample to make sure at least one date is covered. And that will apply for both types of populations, but I just wanted to highlight that under the time-based population. So let's talk about item-based population. Item-based population is that population that is generated at a point in time, or may be generated and can be generated prior to fieldwork period as part of planning procedures. And this cannot be greater than 30 days prior to the start of fieldwork. So some good examples for item-based population is like asset inventory or a list of the current employees. So when the sample selected from item-based population may not be provided to the assessed entity until the fieldwork start date. So the key thing there is to make sure that you do have the population, but the samples must be pulled or submitted, the requested from the assessed entity during the fieldwork period. And I think that has been a confusing key point. When can they get the samples to start reviewing them? The assessors need to note that they start reviewing the samples during fieldwork, but they can actually identify the population and have the population generated prior to the fieldwork period. And then finally, remember, in case your dates shift and the sampled items are no longer able to be tested within the fieldwork period, then you need to resurrect the samples. For example, if you have inventory items you had selected as samples that were decommissioned, or a list of current employees by the time you're pulling their data, they are terminated or have left the company, please be sure to resurrect before your end of fieldwork testing. And that covers those two topics. And we do have more bullet items in regards to that within the assessment handbook. Again, I'll encourage you to make sure you review this section in detail. So the next item or subtopic is one that we've talked a lot about, and that's on the next slide, around zero population. So I just want to clarify, and we've defined it clearly now in the assessment handbook. Zero population occurs when a control has not been performed by the assessed entity within a year prior to the start of fieldwork. So there will be no population. There will be no population that can be tested. The external assessor is expected to confirm the non-occurrence by validating and getting systematic data or corroborative support that has actually not occurred. We've had a couple of discussions around where you do have attestation from management of the assessed entity, but no corroborative evidence. That is not sufficient. Just as Bob mentioned earlier, inquiry alone is insufficient evidence. And so during QA, we'll always follow up and ask questions. How did you get comfortable? So just remember, after getting the supporting corroborating evidence to support that there was no occurrence, then a full implemented score can be used for that requirement statement. So with zero population, you can always score that at 100 if you can corroborate and support that there was no occurrence. Some good examples, and we have more in the assessment handbook, but I want to just give two. For example, if management provides an attestation there were no system changes during the period you've identified for testing, the external assessor should review the change management log. You should at least get systematic data to support that. And then in case of human resource data, like if there has been no new hires, the external assessor should review and validate within the HR systems if truly there are no new hires in that period. The key point we are making here is that with every inquiry or attestation from management that a control has not occurred, there is an opportunity for the external assessor to validate that. And you can validate that with data you already have or have already pulled, or you can work with management to validate, especially systematic data that they can show you that has not occurred. So again, I'm just repeating this, inquiry alone is insufficient evidence. If you have questions during testing or during fieldwork, always feel free to reach out to HITRUST. We can work with you to ensure you pull the right corroborative evidence. And so my last slide on this topic is the next slide. It's very specific to sampling, where the references are and also some key things to keep in mind. With sampling, within the HITRUST scoring rubric, we've documented the minimum requirements. As you can see on this slide, there is a screenshot from the rubric that highlights the different expectations of your sampling-based testing. Please note that this must be followed. Some assessor firms, actually majority of them, may have their own internal guidance for sample sizes. Just make sure you at least meet the minimum HITRUST guidance that we've provided. And then finally, remember that the sampling method utilized may be any type of probability sampling chosen by the external assessor, and the rationale for the method used must be documented. As it was covered earlier by one of my colleagues, within the lead sheet, that's where you document your population details, your sampling methodology details. That helps the HITRUST QA reviewer to understand the approach, to understand the rationale, and to reperform your work and get to the same conclusion. All these key items we are highlighting today is just to make sure that when you submit your assessment for QA, the process is smoother and we have the least questions. And that allows us to publish your draft reports quicker. Again, overall, this is an extensive topic. I just wanted to cover a few key points, and that's the summary on the topic for population and sampling. So now we'll go to how do you handle when you identify exceptions. Samantha.
Thanks, Ida. This next chapter is chapter 11.5 in the assessment handbook for handling and documenting exceptions. This is actually one of the shorter chapters here, so we'll cover this one a little bit quickly. You can go to the next slide. So any exceptions that are noted by the external assessor during their validation of the assessment must result in a corresponding action on the assessment results. So whenever the external assessor comes across an exception, we do expect there to be documentation within the work papers or the assessor comments, and a determination of whether any scores will be impacted by that exception. Typically, if scores are impacted, it's because there's either a reduction in strength or coverage when you're looking at the final maturity scores using the HITRUST scoring rubric. So for each maturity level, you get to your final score using strength and coverage, and typically an exception is going to impact one or both of those levels of strength or coverage that lead to your final score. So here we'll go through one example of handling an exception, and there are many more examples of scoring and how to use strength and coverage on the rubric in Appendix A6. A6 talks about scoring of policy, procedure, and implemented, with quite a few examples in there. The example that we'll go through now is for a requirement statement that says the organization implements endpoint detection and response, EDR technologies, on all endpoints for which such tools are available. The recommended test is to select a sample of endpoints and confirm EDR technologies have been implemented. In this example, the results found that there is one evaluative element in the requirement statement which was reviewed. No impact to coverage. Coverage is very high for this requirement statement. And 10 out of the 25 sampled endpoints did not have the EDR technology implemented. That is the exception that's been noted by the external assessor. So we would expect in the assessor's documentation to see something like this last bullet here. Exception noted, resulting to lower implementation strength, 60%. 60% is that 15 out of 25 that did have the EDR technology implemented. And that indicates an overall score of 50%. If you look at your rubric, if you have it in front of you, we don't have a larger picture of it here, but that 50 or that 60% implementation strength falls under tier 2 strength, which yields a final score of partially compliant or 50% when combined with the very high coverage that we have. Moving on to the next slide, we'll just cover a few more points on handling exceptions. And this first one, I think we've covered already, that all exceptions noted by the external assessor must be documented and captured either within the assessor comment field in MyCSF or within the work papers for the requirement statement. We do expect that documentation to be at a sufficient level to allow anyone reviewing the documentation, either on the external assessor side, so it may be your QA reviewer, your engagement lead, your engagement executive that's reviewing the work paper, or on the HITRUST QA side when the assessment's been submitted to us, to reconcile to the control maturity level that was actually entered in my CSF. So we should be able to follow your documentation, understand what the nature of the exception was, how it impacted scoring based on the rubric, and why the final score is what it is within the assessment. This also helps as we review corrective action plans to understand exactly what the issue was that caused a low score that may have then required a corrective action plan. Now, we do also expect, just to wrap up this section, that any exceptions found by the external assessor during testing are discussed with the assessed entity during the fieldwork period. We do not want to run into situations where the assessed entity doesn't know about an exception until after the assessment is submitted. So that is something that should be discussed during the fieldwork period between the external assessor and the assessed entity to make sure that everyone understands what was identified and what the result is within that assessment. And next, I will turn it back over to Bob to start us off on our last section on not applicable requirement statements.
Thanks again, Samantha. Appreciate that. Yeah, let's talk about non-applicable requirement statements. It does generate quite a few questions from time to time. So let's dive into Chapter 8.3 in the next slide. So in general, my team, the quality team, general statement is that we review every CSF draft report that's getting ready to be posted. One of our key areas that we look at are the NA statements, what statements are NA and what the rationale are. So both quality and assurance would expect a high number of requirements to be scored. There are certain cases where you might have to NA a requirement if it does not apply. So in my CSF, here's a screenshot of exactly where you would click, and then down in subscriber comments, the assessed entity would put their rationale. So let's go into the next slide. And I should have backed up and said we do have an NA rationale decision tree. Thanks, Dennis. Appreciate that. Do look at that. It provides excellent guidance on if a requirement station should or can be marked NA. All right. Let's now move to the next one. So rationale. Again, the assessed entity subscriber comments should not include descriptions of the test procedures or the results, or reference to any supporting evidence, work papers, or emails of people. So those comments appear in the final report and are not appropriate in that section. But the rationale must be clear. It must specify why the requirement, what causes the requirement to not be applicable in the in-scope environment. Generally related to there's no risk or something is just not present. It also must relate to the requirement statement. We can't just have a general statement, oh, we don't do this, it's an NA, or we're some type of entity and not required to, and then that's copy and pasted over and over again. So that is something we wouldn't want. So we want to see where it specifically addresses, the rationale specifically addresses the requirement. And then again, covering the evaluative elements. Rationale should address all aspects of the assessment scope. And of course, that means systems, facilities, third parties. Also, rationale has to be consistent across the assessment. So sometimes we see what we call mixed applicability. And so you'll want to make sure that what you are marking in A would be, again, consistent and not have a mixture of scored requirements that are very similar to the requirement that you're trying to NA or vice versa. More information about that mixed applicability is in Appendix A-2. And it's important, I think, to look at that so that either when the assessment is submitted, it's not kicked back by either our automated processes, or it spawns a lot of questions and tasks from our QA analyst. So I've covered those. Going to turn it over to Ida again to cover the next few slides.
Thank you, Bob. The next slide, we want to cover an example of some an example of acceptable NA rationale and some examples of not acceptable rationale that we've pushed back on in QA, and then end this segment section with a few key points on not applicable requirement statements. So the example we have in front of us is from domain 5. And this is requirement BUID requirement statement 0503 that states wireless access points are in place in secure areas. What we are expecting to see this is the rationale statement should be concise and to the point and stating as is within the assessed entity. So in this case, the example here is that an acceptable rationale would state there is no wireless access points within XYZ organization in scope environments. It can even be there are no wireless access points within XYZ organization. Just be very specific. What is not acceptable is any references to policy or process within the rationale. Just because your report is a report that also has external consumers, they may not have access or preview to your policy or processes. Also, the rationale cannot be pointing the responsibility to a third party because the assessed entity needs to attest also to how that is performed by the third party. For more examples of not applicable requirements, we have outlined them within Appendix A-3 of the Assessment Handbook. And then finally, some key points to leave you with in the next slide. Please note, non-occurrence of a requirement statement cannot be used as a rationale to mark the requirement statement NA. And this goes back to zero population. We've seen it's not as frequent as it used to be. I think with a lot of the assessor firms, we've gotten it to where non-occurrence is truly zero population, but there are situations where we've seen sometimes lately that you've made a requirement statement that should be in place. And the way you review that, and Bob did point to, we do have a decision tree you can use. At the same time, just keep in mind that if the risk exists, whether the control is there or not, then there is a maturity to measure for that control, and it cannot be scored as an A. Then the other key one is a requirement statement being performed by a third party, which is one of the points I made in the previous slide. It's not an appropriate rationale. Just keep in mind with the E1s and I1s, we now do allow for carve out of third-party managed controls. So with that, we would expect to see it's an A because of the carve out. So be very clear on why it's been an A for those ones that you've carved out the third party. But for R2 validated assessment, carve out is not allowed, and we would expect how have you attested to how the third party is performing the control. And then finally, there are requirement statements whose evaluative elements are with several evaluative elements where some are not applicable, while others can be scored. Please make sure the external assessor is documenting clearly those evaluative elements that are NA within their testing work papers or within their test plan, wherever they have the testing approach, and then score the remaining evaluative element. So we will look to make sure when we are reviewing those, if some evaluative elements are NA, did we document that clearly? Because then we would be expecting a full score that includes all the evaluative elements. And one of the other things we've provided within the assessment handbook, and finally within this topic, is there are those requirement statements that would never be an A. And some of them is because the control is actually proving the negative. Like if there is no wireless access points within that environment, the risk could be for any unauthorized access points or rogue access points. So how are you making sure that risk is being addressed? And that's a common one within domain 5. So that's one requirement statement that would never be NA. We have a couple we've outlined again within the appendix of the assessment handbook. Please refer to appendix A-4 on some examples of requirement statements that would never be NA. And that brings us to the end of this session. I encourage you to continue reviewing the assessment handbook, and now I'll turn it to Dennis so that we can answer some of the questions that have come through. Dennis.
All righty, thanks, Ida and Sam and Bob. So we did have a number of questions come in. So if you'll give me just a minute here, I'm going to gather these and then I will farm them back out to the presenters to answer. So give me just a minute here and we'll get started on those. So we had a ton of questions come in. So I'm going to try to get through these as quickly as I can. The first, are completeness and accuracy procedures required at the moment? Page 145 notes that it is temporarily removed. Temporary removal of criteria related to completeness and accuracy for further refinement. Sam, do you want to grab that one?
Yes, thanks, Dennis. So yes, we are further refining that guidance. You may have seen it previously in the exposure draft version of the handbook that was out kind of mid last year, but that is not currently being enforced as we do refine it. I will note that it is best practice to perform completeness and accuracy on any evidence and populations that you're looking at during your testing. And also any changes that we make to the handbook, either adding these requirements in or any other changes that we're making to the criteria, we will provide notice of those changes through the assurance advisories, and we will provide between any versions of the handbook where there have been changes, we'll provide a comparison log detailing those changes, and also a period of time long enough for you all to update your procedures to meet those requirements. So when any new requirements get added or changed, there will be a period of time for you to understand the change and get ready for it to be enforced.
Great answer, Sam. Thank you. So the next one, I'm going to hit this quickly because I have two others that I really want to get to, but how far back can evidence be used for testing? Let's say you have evidence that is 6 months old, for example. Ida, do you want to grab that one really quickly?
Sure, thanks, Dennis. With evidence, please keep in mind, and I know I keep saying key points here, but with evidence, keep in mind 3 things. 1, observation and inspections used to support scoring. That type of evidence must be generated or observed during the fieldwork period. So it's not so much how old it is, it's the timing of reviewing that. Then with the item-based population, which is that population that you generate at a point in time, that can be generated at least no greater than 30 days before start of fieldwork. So again, 6 months would not count here because that would be within 90 days plus additional 30 days. And then finally, the time-based population, that one you have between at least 90 days to up to 12 months. And the key date there to observe is the start of fieldwork date. So just keep in mind, time-based population can go back up to 12 months from the start of fieldwork.
Awesome, thanks, Ida. And I'm going to combine 2 of these, and these are kind of around non-applicables. So the first part of the question, and I'm going to go to Bob on this one. So do NA evaluative elements need the official comment in the assessor comments? And then what would happen if that NA was inherited from a inheritance partner? If you can answer those 2 as a combined answer.
Sorry about that, Dennis, having a disruption here on my side.
It's okay.
So if I heard correctly, one of the questions was, do all the evaluative elements need an official comment? So if that's the case. It's possible that certain elements in a requirement statement are considered an A, while some may be scored. In those cases, the elements considered in A should be documented in the assessor comments or the working papers, and the rationale and scoring is determined upon the remaining evaluative elements. And so you would exclude the non-applicable elements from the scoring calculation. I'll repeat that second part of the
Yeah, Bob.
NA.
Yeah, Bob. So if you have a control requirement that was inherited and the inherited score came back as not applicable for the third party inheritance provider, is there an additional comment needed from the customer side and the assessor side?
So you would need to enter, if the customer's portion is NA, you would enter its rationale in the comments, and then you can actually inherit an NA from the service provider. But you would want to cover both to explain the rationale for an NA for both the customer portion and the service provider.
And just to
Awesome.
jump in here, if it is a 100% inheritance and there is no responsibility on the customer side, then it is fine to just inherit that NA from the service provider. If it's a full inheritance, you don't have an additional comment.
Awesome. I appreciate that clarity. I know you guys get a lot of questions on NAs and split inheritance and stuff like that. And then let's see. I know we've covered zero population a little bit, but this is a good question. Do we need to collect zero population evidence for the sampling period we have identified, or do you need to collect zero population for up to 1 year before field work starts? Ida, do you want to grab that one?
Sure. For zero population is has to include fieldwork period as well. Please keep that in mind. So it depends with the type of population. If it's a time-based population, you go up from the start of fieldwork up to 12 months. You'd need to verify there hasn't been any occurrence. If it's the item-based, a point in time, it's within the fieldwork period as well.
Awesome, appreciate
and then
that.
there was another question linked to that on zero population as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Around does HITRUST have some examples of what data to provide for zero population? I would like to add, if you go to the assessment handbook, Appendix A8, we do have some frequently asked questions on evidence. One of the questions there, we do provide a list of examples of type of data you can pull for certain requirement statements if they are zero population.
All right, thanks, Ida. I appreciate that extra clarity. I've been using that handbook quite a bit myself personally, and I've been here for almost 10 years. There's some really good information in that, in the examples and stuff like that. And I apologize, we are out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off the Q&A at this point. If anyone has any further questions, please feel free to send them into our support channel and we can help address those. Or if you have a customer success manager, feel free to address them through there. Lots of different ways to get your answers. I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. This is number 4 in a 5-part series of webinars over the assessment handbook. Like I said, if you have any other questions on the content or things like that, please feel free to contact customer support or your HITRUST customer success manager. And we did record these sessions and they will be available in the same location where you registered for these. We don't have them all up yet. I apologize. It's we're still getting the other sessions loaded, but these will be available in that area where you registered for this webinar. If anyone needs that link, please feel free to contact support. I can get you that link. I'll make sure my support folks know where to get that to you if you don't have the link anymore. I understand how that happens. But I do want to thank everyone for their time. I want to thank Bob, Ida, and Samantha for taking a few minutes out of their day to help us run through this. And looking forward to seeing everybody next week at 11 o'clock Central for the last of these sessions, where we'll talk about maintaining your assessment, including like interims and stuff like that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the session. Thanks, everybody.